Hi, and welcome to the Process Diary. My name is Paul, your host. Today I'm going to have a look at Blender as a video editing application, or NLE as these programs are normally called. In my day job, I use Final Cut Pro, and on occasion I use Premiere. Now, these packages can cost hundreds of dollars, and a question I'm often asked by enthusiast video editors is, do you know any good free video editing software? Now, this answer is complicated because I do know a few packages, but they're for Linux. And that would normally require the person asking to embrace the Linux OS, install it alongside their Mac or Windows setup, and essentially learn an entirely new operating system for the sake of getting a bit of free kit. So I'd heard a bit about Blender's video editing capabilities. Now, I was always aware it can't do things like, say, capture video. Nowadays, we've kind of steered clear of tape-based media, and now it's almost just like transferring files off the hard drive of your capture device, be it your phone or your camera, transferring it to your job folder and then using your NLE to do the editing. So I'm going to take you through a workflow that I use for my day-to-day jobs. But instead of using Final Cut to do the editing, I'm going to show you how to set up Blender as the program that will be doing the editing of the video. So the first thing we have to do in any editing job, regardless of what program you're using, is to set up a job folder with a clear and defined structure. So here's how I set mine up. Firstly, I go to wherever I'm going to keep my jobs, and I create a new master folder with the title of the project. In this case, I'm calling it Blender NLE Demo. Inside that, I nest three folders. They're labeled Assets, Projects, and Renders. Inside the Assets folder, I nest three more folders. Again, these ones are labeled Audio, Stills, and Video to differentiate between the different types of media that I'll be using. I leave the projects folder alone. This is just to save the blend file. But inside the renders folder, I nest low res and high res. Now, this is a very basic folder setup, one that you can use and add to, but it will suffice for our needs and most jobs that you might get. Now, we need to take a look at the interface of a typical NLE, and I'm going to use the one I use often, Final Cut Pro, as the example. Now, you can see from this picture the screen is broken into a few windows. These include a bin. This is where all your media is stored. It also includes a timeline, a clip preview panel, and a timeline preview panel. Blender's video editing setup is almost there, and if we open it up and select the window configuration from the drop-down called Video Editing, you'll see what I mean. So Blender's default right now is split up in the following way. Where FCP has a bin, Blender has put a graph editor. There is a video sequence editor set to preview, which is an analog for the media preview, but this will only work for the sequencer. The same type of window set to sequencer is the equivalent of our timeline, and just to confuse you, Blender's window labeled timeline is right down the bottom. This window is useful because it has a set of buttons which allow you to play, rewind, and skip to the next or previous clips, and the updates in using this player work on the sequencer at the same time. I'm going to change Blender's default to mirror more closely the Final Cut Pro setup because it makes a little more sense from the perspective of video editing. And my reasons for this are many, but the main couple are that it should make sense to someone who's not used Blender before and wants to do a little video editing. And if you eventually want to fork out a few $100 for a commercial package, you won't have to relearn a lot of basics. So first we need a bin analog. This turns out to be a slight improvement on Final Cut Pro, and more in line with what Premiere does, as you get to navigate to our folder structure we set up earlier. As you populate your folders with assets, they become available in your Blender's editing project. So you change your graph editor to a window called File Browser and navigate to your Assets folder. I like to take away the left-hand portion of this window and just sort of extend that out. You can always bring that back just by clicking on the border and dragging right, but I like just to see my folders. And to illustrate this, I'm going to open up my video folder inside my assets, where I've gone ahead and put a few royalty-free clips in there to illustrate what thumbnail view looks like. This is very useful if you want a visual cue for your asset. I like to swap around the timeline and sequencer, and this is simply a matter of selecting the window type for each from the small button which gives you your window type, and then just adjusting the window height so that the sequencer on the bottom is larger than the timeline. And finally, I'm going to take one more step before saving, and that is to open up the Properties window to the right of the Preview panel. The analog of this in Final Cut is hidden inside a menu, but here we have the option of displaying our render settings as part of our setup. The importance of this will become clear in a moment. Now, one last step. You go and click the plus sign right of the Screen Layout drop-down. It will duplicate the window setup for you, and you can relabel it something that makes sense. In this case, I'm just going to relabel it Video Editing TPD for the Process Diary. Alternatively, you can override the default, but personally I like to keep the defaults there and just add my own to the window setups. Now, I've gone ahead and saved this setup in a blend file, and that's downloadable from processdiary.com, and the link is available via the accompanying blog post to this video. So you can simply load that up and save your default setup that way too. Now, the next thing to consider is what operations you repeat during an edit. These are things such as play, stop, rewind, split clip, ripple edit. You also have to consider what functions work more intuitively as, say, drag and drop, rather than an operation you need to find through a menu. I've gone ahead and focused on the basics and come up with some shortcuts, not all, to reflect how I work in Final Cut and Premiere. And this is where I have to add a caveat. I'm about to rearrange some shortcuts inside of Blender which would mess up most workflows for other tasks such as modeling, texturing, animating, etc., especially for Blender users that are used to certain shortcut keys. Again, I need to stress that I am creating a workflow purely for editing, for a beginner, and for someone who may not necessarily be using Blender for anything else. The good news is that Blender allows you to save presets and then switch back to previously loaded presets such as the Blender default key sets. There are already two which come preloaded for people transitioning from other 3D software applications, for example, 3ds Max or Maya, where popular shortcuts have been remapped for use within Blender. Now, I've gone ahead and done the same thing for Final Cut Pro, and the preset file can be downloaded from the blog post and from the download sections from processdiary.com. From here on in, however, I'll be explaining things using these presets and not the defaults inside Blender. In Blender, open File, go to User Preferences, and click Input on the User Preferences panel that comes up. Now, you click on the drop-down which should say Blender, and here you'll notice the preset configurations for all the programs which come preloaded with Blender. Go to the bottom of the User Preferences panel and click Import Key Configuration. Navigate to where you downloaded the file fcp_keypreset.py and load it. This should load in your preferences automatically, but if it doesn't, click the drop-down menu and select it. Now we finally get stuck into some editing. So the first step is to go to your Properties panel and check your settings. You should set your render settings to reflect the compression of the footage you're working with. It's generally a rule of thumb that you should try to work with a consistent format, and while this may not always be the case, if you're an enthusiast or are editing your own material, chances are you've taken all the footage on the same device, be it your phone or video camera, etc. Adjust the settings based on those specifications. In my case, I'm using HD 1280 by 720p files. And because I'm in Australia, I operate on the PAL system, and that runs at 25 frames per second. If you're in the US or Japan, you're likely to be using NTSC, in which case you set your frame rate to 29.97 frames per second, or 30 frames per second in some cases. Once you've selected a video format and set your frame rate, scroll right down to the output section and select a video format from the drop-down. I'm on a Mac, so QuickTime Uncompressed 422 should be great. Now in audio, I'm going to choose LPCM 44.1 kHz because I've compressed all my audio to WAV. This seems to be the only format which Blender can draw a waveform on at the moment. So if you're going to be doing a lot of audio editing or editing to beats of the music, for example, you might want to work with WAV files instead of MP3s or AIFs, etc. Finally, you want to set your output to your project files renders folder in high res. This is where the final output will end up once you've finished your edit. So now let's grab some media and put it down on the timeline. As I edit, I'm going to point out a few hidden settings which will enhance your workflow greatly. I'm going to first navigate to my audio folder inside my assets folder, and here I've downloaded a royalty-free track from soundcloud.com. I drag and drop this onto my timeline. Now note that green line on the sequencer. This is known as a scrubber because it scrubs backwards and forwards along your timeline. Dragging your clip into the timeline and clicking will allow the clip to snap to wherever the scrubber is sitting. Now you notice the little numbers down the bottom of the sequencer? These are counted in frames. It's telling you how many frames there are in the sequence. Now, when editing, I prefer to look at things in minutes and seconds. It seems like a better idea since you're dealing in time. So let's set the sequencer count to that by going to the View menu and ticking the Show Seconds box. And you'll notice that it updates. And now instead of showing 240 or 250 odd frames, it's showing around 9.1 or 10 seconds or something like that. Now with the clip selected, and you can left click it if it's not, look over to the right and you can see some properties show up in the Properties panel. Scroll down to the tick box labelled Draw Waveform and tick it. Now Blender now draws the waveform over the clip. You can zoom in by middle mouse scrolling, I believe, or I'm on a MacBook Pro, so I'm actually just sort of pinching in and out here until the clip is wide enough, and you'll notice the waveform appear over the clip. Zooming is a little tricky in Blender because when you zoom out, it scales the clip both vertically and horizontally. Sometimes you only want to scale horizontally so you can see things such as a waveform vertically. To zoom out only horizontally, notice down the bottom where we've just switched over to seconds, there's a light grey bar overlaid on the seconds timeline with a couple of dots. If you click and drag the right hand dot, it scales the timeline up or down, but only in the horizontal. This light grey area is showing you the region of the timeline that you're zoomed into on the sequencer. But you'll notice that the vertical scale remains the same. This is pretty cool. Now we can see a decent waveform at all times. If you hit spacebar to play, you'll hear the audio. But if you just left click and drag, you might not hear anything. What you want to do now is enable something called audio scrubbing. Now this is located in the playback menu above the sequencer in your timeline window. Tick the box labelled audio scrubbing. Now when you left click and drag across the timeline, you'll hear the audio. I'm now going to trim this clip so it becomes the bed for my edit. Blender trims clips in two ways, one of which I've disabled in my key preset. In nonlinear editing, a clip on the timeline is actually an instance of a larger clip, represented by a proxy, described by an in and an out point. This means that a soft cut, as Blender calls it, is a non-destructive trim which enables you to roll the edit and reveal any media beyond the cut point. This is great if you want to fine-tune later. Now, a hard cut in Blender terms means that when you roll this point, you get a freeze frame instead and not the rest of the media. Not so useful unless you use a lot of freeze frames between edits. I've assigned the B key here to split clips because this is what corresponds to the Final Cut Pro and Premiere blade tool. So I scrub to the audio section I wish to start from. I select the clip and hit B. There you'll notice it splits the clip. I select the front portion and hit delete and confirm the delete. I then hit the home key to send the scrubber to the head of the timeline, and then I hit Shift S to snap the clip to the scrubber. Now let's get some footage down. I've got a couple of clips I want to use, so I navigate back to my video folder inside my assets folder. And I select my first clip. This is of the Manhattan skyline shot from the point of view from Brooklyn, and drag it down onto my timeline. Now notice it actually brings in two clips. The blue one on the top is actually the video, and the green is the audio that accompanies this clip. Now I don't need the audio here, so I select it and delete it. I then play the clip to search for a nice in point. Split using the B key, discarding the part I don't want, and snap it to the beginning of the timeline the same way I did for the audio bed. I hit home to send the scrubber to the beginning of the timeline, then Shift S to snap the selected clip to the scrubber. Now, at this point, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that the preview and render areas are only about 10 seconds long, or 250 frames. We'll need to extend this eventually, as playback will only loop inside this area. I'm going to do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation and suggest my total edit will be about 30 seconds long. So 30 seconds times 25 frames equals about 750 frames. I key in 750 as my end frame in the timeline window. Now this will make things a little bit easier for my edit. I play my clip and hit the space bar when I think the clip has gone on long enough. I split it and discard the end portion. Now I want to demonstrate what a soft cut does here. See, you'll notice that there's this blue bar above the clip on the end here. This shows that there's more media that we can access. So if I click and drag on the back of this clip where this arrow is, I can access those frames, and if I roll back I delete the frames, but only on this proxy. So now let's bring in the next two clips one after the other and repeat the steps. I'll highlight a few other neat things about the Blender interface here. Notice that if I drag a clip along the timeline, it actually tells me which frame it's sitting on. It will indicate in red if you're overlapping, as you can see here. So in case you don't want to destroy that edit point, you can just slide it back a little. Now I'll trim this clip the same way that I trimmed the last one with a B key split, select the portion of the clip I don't want and delete it. Then I'll bring in the next clip. trim it. And then I'll trim the endpoint for my entire project. I think I want to sort of leave it there. These 3 clips should be the nice short edit for now. Now, I noticed that the end frame here in my timeline window is around about 304 frames. I didn't need all the 750 frames after all. So I'll make it just a little longer than 304, let's say 325. It's a nice round whole second number. It's 7 seconds. And so that is essentially the edit that I've worked on here. Now, before I wrap this up, I'm going to polish off the audio by fading it out, and this will dovetail nicely into a future video where I spend more time talking about transitions. So the way I do a fade out at the end is I select this audio clip and I scrub to where I want to begin my audio fade out, let's say around here. Now, because the clip's selected, I can look at its properties in the properties panel. Now I scroll down until I find the volume slider and notice where it says 1. 1 is the maximum volume setting and 0 is obviously the minimum. Most of Blender's sliders go from 0 to 1, almost like a 0 to 100% type thing, rather than giving you levels such as a dB count or anything like that. And we're going to set a keyframe by hitting the I key. We just hover over the volume slider and then hit the I key and it turns yellow. See how it does that? I'm going to replace my file browser momentarily with the graph editor window, the one that we saw when it was originally set up for video editing. I do this so you can see what's going on. Now I'll zoom in to where the keyframe has been made on this little pink line here. You'll see a small dot there, and you'll notice that there's a green scrubber along here as well. I'll scrub on my sequence editor to around about the end of the clip, and then I'll change the volume from 1 to 0. I'll hit the I key, producing a second keyframe, and effectively you'll see that this curve has been created in the graph editor. This is basically a fade out. Now, if I play it, it sounds a little too abrupt, so I'm going to grab one of the points by selecting the point, hitting the G key, and dragging this back to the left. This is essentially lengthening the fade out so it's a little bit softer. And that's the edit so far. I'm going to leave this tutorial here for now. I'm not going to dwell on transitions or exporting. I'm going to leave those for other tutorials down the track. We're around about the 20-minute mark here. But this should cover the basics and get you started, hopefully, on editing with Blender. I'd love it if you leave any comments or critiques or questions in the comment section when you find this video, either on the YouTube channel or on the Facebook page or at processdiary.com on the blog post. I'll be happy to respond, and if you've got any suggestions, I'll be happy also to learn from anyone who might suggest improvements to an editing workflow. Hopefully I can get a follow-up tutorial dealing with transitions and the like in the next week or so stay tuned. But for now, this is Paul from The Process Diary, signing off. Bye for now.